Hey, it's Professor Dave. Let's talk about Dwight Eisenhower.
He knows a lot about all kinds of stuff. Professor Dave explains.
Dwight David Eisenhower was the first president to have been a military hero since Ulysses Grant nearly a century earlier. Like his predecessor Truman, Ike had to deal with Cold War tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. That the world avoided nuclear confrontation is to his credit. But during the Eisenhower administration, the United States continued to grow into a massive national security state by extending trends begun under Truman. After serving in the Army under General Douglas MacArthur, who famously called Eisenhower the best clerk I ever had, Eisenhower was made head of the Allied forces in the European theater during World War II. Unlike the vain MacArthur, Eisenhower was diplomatic, able to coordinate the egos of such men as French General Charles de Gaulle, British General Bernard Montgomery, and his own George S. Patton. It was Eisenhower who made the monumental decision to undertake the D-Day invasion during inclement weather, rightly thinking that his risky decision would catch the Germans off guard. In June of 1944, the American, British, and French forces stormed ashore onto the European continent, and it seemed as if they would reach Berlin by year's end. But Eisenhower was caught by surprise in December when the Germans launched a counteroffensive. The resulting Battle of the Bulge brought the biggest losses of the war. Regardless, with the massive Russian army pouring through Poland, the Third Reich was doomed, and the Russians reached Berlin in April 1945, having lost nearly 10 million soldiers and civilians during the war. Eisenhower later endured some criticism for allowing the Red Army to reach Berlin first. With the Russians controlling virtually all of Eastern Europe, the stage was set for the post-war conflict between the US and the USSR, the two superpowers emerging from the rubble of the worldwide cataclysm. Eisenhower himself became wildly popular, and both Democratic and Republican parties wooed him to run on their tickets. He declined and instead accepted the presidency of Columbia University, afterwards becoming the first Supreme Commander of NATO in 1951. But in 1952, with the unpopular Korean War in a stalemate, Eisenhower accepted the GOP presidential nomination and handily defeated the Democrat Adlai Stevenson with the memorable campaign slogan, "I like Ike."
Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president, Ike for president.
You like Ike, I like Ike, everybody likes Ike
For president.
Hang out the banner, beat the drum, we'll take Ike to Washington.
He promptly signed the truce that ended the war in Korea, and after Stalin died, Eisenhower negotiated a peace treaty that ended the occupation of Austria, returning it to neutral status. While the American economy was the envy of the world, bustling along with the greatest standard of living the world had ever seen, it was also a time of great anxiety. The Joseph McCarthy communist witch hunts were poisoning American political life, and Eisenhower did little to stop McCarthy's scare tactics, having picked an equally aggressive red baiter, Richard Nixon, as his vice president. With the fall of China to the communist leader Mao Zedong, and the revelations of communist spies giving American nuclear secrets to the Russians, paranoia seeped into the very fabric of American society. Despite unprecedented prosperity in 1950s America, it truly was the best of times and the worst of times. The Eisenhower administration embarked on a series of international interventions that would have enormous consequences in the future. When the British government under Winston Churchill requested U.S. assistance in overthrowing the popular Iranian government of Mossadegh because he wanted to nationalize the Iranian oil industry that British Petroleum controlled, Truman flatly rejected the proposal. But a year later, Churchill's request found a receptive audience in the Eisenhower administration, particularly with the firm anti-communist brothers, Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and CIA Director Allen Dulles. These two men would drive American foreign policy during the 50s and turn the CIA, which began as a mere intelligence-gathering agency, into a state-sponsored anti-communist machine, overthrowing foreign governments that were perceived as threats to Western business interests. Though the American-backed coup was successful in Iran in 1952, it would come back to haunt the U.S. 26 years later when the Iranian people rose up against the US-installed Shah, leading to the fundamentalist regime of Ayatollah Khomeini. A year later, the same thing was repeated in Guatemala when the legally elected government wanted to nationalize the United Fruit Company and end its brutal working conditions. Unfortunately for Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz, Allen Dulles was on the board of directors at the United Fruit Company, and his brother had served as the company's lawyer. The relatively modest reforms Arbenz proposed were seen as a communist threat to American business interests. The CIA organized an invasion that staged a coup d'etat and installed a US-backed dictator, ending the so-called Guatemalan Revolution of economic liberalization, and in turn, ending democracy in Guatemala for over 4 decades. This coup inflamed anti-American sentiment in Latin America and inspired other revolts in the region. In the Middle East, in 1956, the CIA made plans to overthrow the Syrian government because it would not cooperate with Western anti-communism efforts. The plan called for the use of the Iraqi army and then shifted its focus to agents within Syria itself. But when Israel and Britain invaded Egypt during the Suez Crisis, the plan was called off, with the sentiment that it could not succeed during a time of Israeli aggression against a neighboring Arab country. But plans for a Syrian regime change continued, including an assassination attempt in 1957, in collusion with the British intelligence service MI6. In yet another example of the CIA making policy decisions, Allen Dulles ordered the murder of imprisoned African pan-nationalist Patrice Lumumba to be an urgent and prime objective after learning incoming President John F. Kennedy would order his release. Lumumba was killed by Belgian allies 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration. To his credit, when the French fortress of Dien Bien Phu fell to the Vietnamese communists in May 1954, Eisenhower refused to provide military intervention, despite urgings from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and Vice President Nixon, though he did authorize economic assistance to France to continue fighting. In 1954, the Geneva Conference met to determine the future of Vietnam. The Soviet Union, the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and the People's Republic of China participated throughout the conference, addressing the future of post-colonial Vietnam following the Indochina War between France and the Viet Minh. They produced the Geneva Accords, which separated Vietnam into 2 zones, a northern zone governed by the Viet Minh and a southern zone governed by former Emperor Bao Dai, with a general election to be held by July 1956 to create a unified state. In 1955, there was a referendum in South Vietnam between Vietnamese Prime Minister Ngo Dinh and Bao Dai. Diem would win 98.2% of the vote, though the vote was suspiciously fraudulent. A total of 605,000 votes were cast, despite there being only 405,000 registered voters. The popular communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, was set to win the 1956 national election, vowing to unify the country. Eisenhower, afraid of losing another Asian country to communists, had Diem cancel the proposed national election. And so the stage was set for the war that would tear America apart in the decades to come. The U.S. was stunned in 1957 when the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first orbiting satellite in space. This fed the paranoia that the United States was being surpassed by the USSR, and Eisenhower immediately called for an increase in American exploration of outer space. The space race was on. He created NASA as a civilian space agency in October 1958, paving the way for spy satellite technology to orbit over sovereign territory. As fear spread through the United States that the Soviet Union would invade, Eisenhower wanted to not only create a surveillance satellite to detect any threats, but also ballistic missiles to protect the United States. Ike devised the American basic strategy of nuclear deterrence based upon the triad of B-52 bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, and Polaris submarine-launched missiles. Much of Eisenhower's domestic policy was inevitably linked to the Cold War, including one of his most enduring achievements, championing the interstate highway system in 1956. He justified the project through the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956 as essential to American security during the Cold War, believing that large cities would be targets, and therefore an interconnected national highway system would facilitate evacuations and speed military transportation. Even civil rights was tied to the Cold War. The administration declared racial discrimination a national security issue, as communists around the world used America's history of discrimination and racial violence to criticize the myth of American freedom and equality. In his first State of the Union address in February 1953, Eisenhower stated, "I propose to use whatever authority exists in the office of the President to end segregation in the District of Columbia, including the federal government and any segregation in the armed forces." When he encountered opposition from the services, he used government control of military spending to force the change. Eisenhower told District of Columbia officials to make Washington a model for the rest of the country in integrating black and white public school children. He proposed to Congress the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 1960 and signed those acts into law. The 1957 Act established a permanent civil rights office inside the Justice Department and a civil rights commission to hear testimony about abuses of voting rights. And the 1960 Act assured federal inspection of voter registration polls. Although both acts were much weaker than subsequent civil rights legislation, they constituted the first significant civil rights acts since 1875. In 1957, the state of Arkansas refused to integrate their public school system despite the Brown versus the Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court, which declared that the segregation of public schools was unconstitutional. Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus resisted the court order, and Eisenhower responded with federal intervention, whereby the 101st Airborne Division of the Army personally escorted 9 black students into Little Rock Central High School. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote to Eisenhower to thank him, stating, "The overwhelming majority of Southerners, Negro and white, stand firmly behind your resolute action to restore law and order in Little Rock." Ike called himself a progressive conservative. He expanded Social Security and other New Deal programs and combined them into a new cabinet-level agency, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, while extending benefits to an additional 10 million workers, and maintained such popular Roosevelt policies as support for labor unions. In his televised farewell speech, Eisenhower raised the specter of the Cold War and the role of the U.S. Armed Forces. He was deeply troubled by the growth of militaristic sentiments, feeling that such actions could bring about the end of civilization, and said, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex." It was a bold prophetic speech, warning of the growth of a national economy based upon being permanently at war. Eisenhower confronted communism aggressively, but also judiciously avoided conflicts sought by McCarthy and other hawks in his government. He projected a warm, comforting, grandfatherly image that reassured the public during a time of growing Cold War anxiety. Voted Gallup's most admired man 12 times, he achieved widespread esteem both in and out of office. He has consistently been rated as one of the greatest U.S. presidents. Thanks for watching, guys. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.